morning once again. This is Andy Collins with Tridia Partners. Thanks for joining us for this half-hour webinar on 1099 reporting in Dynamics AX. If we have questions, everybody's going to be on mute, so if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in to the GoToWebinar console, and we'll address them at the end of the half hour. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Robin Ellsworth, one of our AX application consultants. So take it away, Robin.
Hi, everybody. I'm Robin. I'm an AX functional consultant, and I specialize in procurement and workflows, as well as other areas of AX. So today we're going to be reviewing 1099 report processing in Microsoft Dynamics AX 2012 R3. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth between PowerPoint and our AX demo environment. Once again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the message, and then we'll get to those at the end. Also, this slide deck is going to be available, so if anybody would like the slide deck, please contact Tridia or me directly. Our contact info will be on the last slide. And let's get started. So 1099 reporting. Businesses are required to file with the IRS and provide individual reports to their vendors every year. The dates for providing the individual reports to the vendors is usually the last day of January. So we want to make sure we give ourselves enough time to prepare for this and print our reports so we can mail them and make sure that we don't get hit with that penalty. The end of year process is for 1099 is performed by the Accounts Payable Department. They're going to review all of their vendors and ensure that the 1099 vendors are marked appropriately within the system. They're also going to verify that the W-9s were received from the 1099 vendors. And then lastly, they're going to review vendor invoices and make any adjustments needed to those amounts. So they're going to review the invoice lines and verify that the 1099 amounts are captured accurately. And generally, 1099 amounts are for services. So if there's any goods that were purchased or paid for, those aren't going to be included in the 1099 reportable amounts. So within AX, there's a couple setups you need to do so that you can process 1099 reports. It's minimal. First, in the legal entity form, which I have the navigation path here within AX, it's in the Organization Administration module. On the 1099 tab, you're going to go ahead and enter your company's federal tax ID, and that's going to show when you print the reports in your federal tax ID field. There's also a form within AX which lists all of the 1099 fields. And if any of those minimum amount reportable change within the year, which will be shared by the IRS, so if any of the 1099 box minimum amounts change, you can navigate to this form and update those amounts. We'll look at that in just a moment. And then lastly, you'll want to make sure all of your vendors are set up correctly to record those 1099 transactions. So let's go ahead and talk about the vendor record setup for 1099. And we're going to go ahead and open our AX demo environment here. We're going to go to the vendor. That's in the Accounts Payable module. Under Common, there's a Vendors tab to expand in the All Vendors list page. So on this list page, it lists all the vendors, and then whichever vendor I have selected here, in the ribbon up here, I can take action on that record, or I can double-click to open the record itself and make any changes within that record. So I personalized my list page to bring in 2 additional columns. One's the Report 1099 box, and you can see that if I'm reporting these vendors as 1099, the checkbox is selected. So I can put a filter on this list page to only show me my 1099 vendors that I have the Report 1099 checkbox selected. I also added this 1099 box column to my grid so I can see which 1099 box is being reported on for these vendors. Now, if I want to see vendors where I selected a 1099 box, but maybe I forgot to enable the Report 1099 functionality, I saved another filter for that. So here we can see that, this vendor, I may need to review their invoices, and if I forgot to report them as 1099, then I could run that process we talked about earlier. All right. So I just wanted to explain a little bit how the 1099 amounts are captured during the invoicing process. So there's 2 ways to process a vendor invoice in AX. One is for a non-purchase order invoice. So if it's non-purchase order related, there's a form, a journal called the Vendor Invoice Journal. And you'll create the journal and go in the lines of the journal. And here I have a little screenshot. The lines are here on the Overview tab. But if I have my line selected and I click this 1099 tab, then here for the line, it shows me which 1099 box is going to be populated with that information. With the 1099 amount. And then here, my 1099 amount will default based on the invoice amount for that line. Now, if only a portion of that amount should be recorded as 1099, I can actually edit the amount in this field. So if my invoice was for $800, but only $750 of it was reportable as 1099, I would go ahead and edit this field and enter a negative $750. I just want to point out that in this form, you do have to enter the amount as a negative because of the way AX processes the 1099 amount in the background. I just wanted to point that out. But it is, a positive invoice amount. All right, and then the other way to record a 1099 amount would be on a purchase order. During invoicing, on the purchase order, so in my little screenshot down here, this is the purchase order line that I'm invoicing for a service. And I can expand this line details tab, and here again we see the 1099 box and the 1099 amount. And this can be edited as needed. Now, at the end of the year, when the AP department is reviewing all the paid vendor invoices, this is after all the invoices have been posted. So we just looked at how the 1099 amount is captured during processing. And now we're going to discuss reviewing those invoices. And if any amounts need to be adjusted, we can do that in the vendor settlements for 1099 form. So generally, all companies perform the 1099 review differently, but generally they're going to review the 1099 invoices and review the amounts and make adjustments necessary. Usually the 1099 amounts are for services and not goods. And then you also want to make sure that there's no pass-through amounts that have been overlooked. So if you've previously reimbursed your vendor for any expenses, you want to make sure that you're not recording those again as 1099 at the end of the year. So there's 2 ways to review those vendor settlement for 1099 amounts. You can do that from the individual vendor record, or there's a form in the accounts payable module that you can review all the vendors at once. So let's go back in AX and take a look at that. So here we are again on my vendor list page. I'm going to select this vendor, SER002, and up here on my ribbon in the tax information area, here's my vendor settlements for 1099 forms. So the vendor settlements for 1099 form, it has criteria, so you can enter a from date and a to date. So we're going to want to enter our from date and to date for a reporting year. And since we're in the vendor record, it automatically filters it just for that vendor. So here is our 1099 total settled federal 1099 amount for this vendor. If we want to see the individual invoices and transactions, we can click Tax 1099 Transactions. So here we can see all the individual invoices that were posted and paid for this vendor. Here's the 1099 amount. And if you need to make any adjustments, you can just click in here and adjust the amount. Now if I drag this down a little bit so we can see the initial amount, once I make this adjustment, so I change the amount by $300, and then I close this form, it's automatically going to save the changes I made and adjust the total 1099 amount. Now this IRS reportable checkbox, this just indicates that the amount recorded is over the minimum reportable amount for this 1099 box. So I mentioned this earlier, there's a form where you can set up the minimum amounts per 1099 box. So let's jump to that form very quickly. In AX, if you come to a field where you need to enter a new value or you want to quickly jump to that table without having to navigate, you can right-click in the field and choose View Details, and that works as a hyperlink to open the associated form in the field that you clicked in. So this is our 1099 field form. The first column is the 1099 box and a description of each box. And then here's the minimum amount. So if, within the next year that minimum amount changes according to the IRS, you can come in AX and edit that amount. I'm going to close this form. And I'm also going to close this vendor settlements for 1099 form as well. All right. Earlier I also mentioned that if a vendor was not marked as 1099 and you notice that they need to be reported on for 1099, there's a process you can run to update all the previous vendor invoices as 1099 reportable. So for instance, let me find my 1099 vendor. So I noticed from my list page that vendor REN002 should be reported as 1099. And they're missing from this list page. Oh, excuse me. So here I can see that I selected the 1099 box, but I forgot to record or mark that this vendor should be recorded to report 1099s on. So I'm going to edit this vendor record. Now I'm within the vendor record, and there's a lot of tabs where I can enter information. I'm going to open the 1099 tab, and right here I can see that I need to check my Report 1099 checkbox. Once I receive the W-9, I can also check this checkbox as well to record that, and then I want to verify that the federal tax ID is there, the 1099 box is there as well. Now, for this vendor, if I look at their vendor settlements for last year, I can see that there's no transactions here right now, so I need to update those transactions. So to do that, actually let me close the vendor record so it saves. So now on my list page, I have the same action buttons. So I'm going to go into this Update 1099 form. In this form, I specify the year that I want to update transactions for as 1099, and then I want to update all of the transactions, and I click OK. So now, if I navigate back to the vendor settlement for 1099 form and enter the correct reporting year, those 1099 transactions are now there, and I can print a report for that vendor. So if we look at the tax 1099 transactions, it's populated the invoices and the amounts, and then if I need to do any adjustments, I can do that. I'm going to close those forms. All right, so that was from the vendor record. If you want to review all the vendor invoices at one time, that's in the accounts payable module under the periodic area under vendor settlements for 1099. So I'm going to put my reporting year criteria in there. You can also, so once I put my date criteria, here's all the vendors that I'm going to print 1099 reports for. Now, notice here that the IRS reportable checkbox is not checked for these vendors because the settled federal 1099 total is less than the minimum reportable amount. So if I print the reports for all these vendors, it's not going to print for the first two vendors because it's below the minimum amount. If I want to only view certain vendors or print for a couple vendors, I can use this from vendor to vendor drop down to filter. All right, so I'm going to, and here, as in the last form we saw from the vendor record, if I select this vendor, click tax 1099 transactions, excuse me, I can again make any adjustments necessary. Also, if we chose the wrong 1099 box, we can correct that here as well. All right, so now we're going to generate an individual 1099 report, and that's done from here in this vendor settlements for 1099 form. So for our demo, I'm just going to print one. So I can enter the vendor and the criteria here, and when I'm ready to print the reports, I'll click Print. I can select the type of form I'm going to be printing for. In this case, it's the miscellaneous tax form. I can enter the reporting year, and then optionally, if I have a range of vendors here and I want to only print for one state at a time, I can select the state here. When you're printing these, make sure that you click Destinations and select the printer that you want to print. And at this point, also head over to the printer and put in your 1099 report stock. So I'm going to print this to screen for our demo. And then you just click OK, and the 1099 report is generated. You can also export this as a PDF or save it as a file. Here's some more options. A nice feature in AX is if you run a report and then you want to run it with different parameters, you don't have to close the report, open the form again, and re-choose your parameters. There's this option tab, and you can just change parameters. All right, so that was the 1099 report. You can also create an export file for the IRS. There's some setup involved. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So The setup is minimal. There's a 1099 transmitter form, and that's where you set up your company contact info for filing electronically. There's also the 1099 software vendor form, where you specify whether you have an in-house or a third-party vendor software that you're going to use for transmitting the 1099 file electronically. And then the last step, we saw that create export file button in the vendor settlements for 1099 form is to actually click that button and generate the file. Now, I believe that you don't have to submit the file to the IRS until about March. So it's always a good idea to generate some test files and work with the IRS to make sure that the file is in the format that they need, and allow yourself plenty of time for that. On that same note, if you're providing individual 1099 reports to the vendors, make sure that you print a test report. Give yourself some time so that if that report needs to be modified in any way, you can contact Tridea or your VAR, and they can, usually it's just the alignment on the report needs to be slightly tweaked. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time to print a test report. Lastly, there's a couple 1099 related reports within AX. The first one is the Tax 1099 Summary Report. So that shows 1099 reportable amounts grouped by vendor account. And here's the navigation path for that report. So it gives a higher level look at your 1099 reporting. There's also a Tax 1099 Detail Report. And this one is also grouped by vendor account, but it shows you more detail for the transactions, such as the date, the voucher, the invoice number, and it's also totaled and grouped by vendor account. And then lastly, there's a duplicate taxpayer identification report, and you can run this to verify that no vendors have the same taxpayer ID. All right, so that completes the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for attending.